All right, today we're jumping way back in time, back to the late Bronze Age, to get to know one of the ancient world's real powerhouses, the Mycenaeans. These were some seriously fierce warriors, incredible builders, and savvy traders who basically ran the Greek mainland long before places like Athens and Sparta were even a big deal.
So let's start with maybe their most legendary achievement. We're talking about walls so enormous that for centuries after they were built, people honestly believed that only mythical giants could have possibly put them together. And, understanding these incredible fortresses is really the key to understanding the Mycenaeans themselves.
So our first stop on this tour is going to be their amazing hilltop fortresses. Now, these weren't just cities. You got to think of them more like military command centers, designed from the ground up to be almost impossible to conquer.
The Mycenaeans were super strategic. They didn't just build anywhere. They picked these high hills with really steep cliffs. Why? Well, it gave them a massive defensive advantage. Guards could see enemies coming from miles away, and any army trying to attack would be totally wiped out from the climb before they even reached the gates.
And okay, let's say you did manage to make it all the way up to the walls. This is what you'd be facing. They were often over 20 feet thick. They were built out of these colossal limestone blocks that weighed several tons each, and they were fit together so perfectly that they didn't even need mortar to keep them in place. Just incredible. The engineering was just so far ahead of its time that later Greeks, when they saw these ruins, they couldn't explain it. So they came up with a legend. They figured only the mythical one-eyed giants, the cyclops, could have had the muscle to build something like this.
And that's exactly where we get the technical term. Cyclopean masonry is a name that comes directly from that sense of awe the ancients felt. It just perfectly captures how people saw these buildings for centuries, not as the work of humans, but as the work of giants.
Okay, so these fortresses were clearly designed to keep people out. But what was it actually like for the people living inside? Especially, for the ones at the very top of the food chain. All right, let's head inside, because this was a world with a really strict hierarchy. The king ruled everything from the spectacular palace complex right at the very center of the whole citadel.
So as you walked up to the great city of Mycenae, this is the first thing you'd see. And the Lion Gate wasn't just an entrance. It was part military checkpoint, part political statement. It sent a really clear message to anyone who passed through. You are now entering a place of incredible power.
Deep inside the palace, you'd find its most important room, the megaron. This was the absolute heart of the kingdom. It's where the king held court, where he met with his generals, and where he held all the big ceremonies around a huge fire pit in the center.
Yeah, the megaron was way more than just a big room. It was the political, social, and even the religious command center for all of Mycenaean society. And its design was so important that it actually became the blueprint for later Greek temples. Pretty cool, right?
The giant walls, the focus on power, it all tells you a lot about their culture, doesn't it? This was a society that was basically organized for war, with a highly respected warrior class and a very, very clear social ladder.
Mycenaean warriors were decked out. We're talking long spears, heavy bronze swords, and these massive shields. The top fighters wore bronze armor and these really intimidating helmets made from dozens of wild boar tusks. That helmet was a clear signal that the person wearing it was a seriously skilled and dangerous hunter.
And their society was structured just like a pyramid. At the very top, you had the king, who they called the Wanox. He had total control. Below him, you had the military commanders and priests who helped him run the show. And the whole base of the pyramid was made up of the regular folks, farmers, craftsmen, whose work supported everybody else. And right at the bottom were slaves.
But, it wasn't all just about war. The Mycenaeans were also really sophisticated. They created beautiful art, they had a huge trade network, and they developed the very first form of writing ever seen on the Greek mainland.
To manage a kingdom this complex, you've got to keep good records, right? So Mycenaean scribes came up with a script we now call Linear B. But here's the interesting part. This wasn't for writing poetry or epic adventure stories. Nope, it was purely for business. These little clay tablets with Linear B on them, you can think of them like ancient spreadsheets. Seriously. They list things like taxes, shipments of olive oil, how many sheep they had, what military gear was in storage. They give us this amazing, detailed look into the palace economy.
And that economy was plugged into the wider world.
The Mycenaeans sailed all over the Mediterranean, exporting stuff like their famous painted pottery and olive oil, and in return, they were importing the raw materials they desperately needed, especially copper and tin, which, as you know, you mix together to make bronze for all those important weapons and armor.
And their artistic talent was everywhere you looked. They made this beautiful pottery decorated with octopuses and chariot races. The palace walls were covered in these vibrant paintings called frescoes, which showed everything from royal parades to epic hunting scenes. So for centuries, the Mycenaeans were a major force to be reckoned with. Their fortresses were unconquerable, they had immense wealth, and their influence was all over the sea. But then, it all just came to a sudden and very dramatic end.
In a pretty short span of time, all the great centers of Mycenaean power were just destroyed. The massive palaces were burned to the ground, the cities were left empty, and their entire way of life just seemed to evaporate.
And this, right here, is one of the biggest mysteries in all of ancient history. How could a culture that was so strong, so organized, and so focused on military might just collapse so quickly and so completely? Historians are still trying to figure that one out.
Well, there are a few big theories. Maybe they were weakened by civil wars between the kingdoms. Or maybe they were overwhelmed by mysterious invaders that ancient texts call the Sea Peoples. Or what if it was natural disasters, like huge earthquakes or a long drought that ruined their crops? The real answer is probably a mix of all these things hitting at once. And in the chaos that followed, their writing system was completely lost and Greece entered what we call a dark age.
And that leaves us with something to think about. The story of the Mycenaeans really shows just how fragile even the most powerful civilizations can be. It makes you wonder, right? When a culture loses its ability to write down its own history, how much of the human story is just lost forever?